The year is 1937, and the world is heading towards war. Italy is making moves in East Africa. Japan is entrenched in a war with China, and Germany is rapidly rearming in flagrant disregard of the Treaty of Versailles. It appears that the war to end all wars ended nothing. These developments threaten Britain and her empire, and in response, she embarks on an effort to make herself ready for war, to which calls are handed out for new fighting vehicles. Britannic Arms answers that call with its state-of-the-art cruiser tank Mark I. The BA5 was crafted to meet strict specifications from the War Office. As with all cruiser tanks, the main priority was speed, to which they could use to exploit breakthroughs in an enemy's line, and the BA5 more than exceeded this requirement. The design was met with excitement from the General Staff, who were intrigued by its prospects, however balked at the predicted long production time. In addition, they were not confident in Britannic's capabilities in delivering such a tank in the numbers needed. But no matter, their tank was here, and it was quickly placed into production alongside its contemporaries of the A9 and A10 cruisers. By 1939, 162 BA5s were produced, and to avoid confusion, the Britannic Arms cruisers would not be given an official cruiser tank mark, and were simply known by their BA number. BA5s fought valiantly in the battles for France and North Africa, where they're reportedly well liked by their crews. However, many also mention troubles with reliability, particularly related to its suspension. Welcome back to Sprocket, and to my second era of tank design. This means we're going to be looking at tanks that were inspired by those of 1937 to 1940. Not only is this for continuity's sake, but also I remember when I was still a young whippersnapper, and my knowledge of tanks came only from War Thunder. And that meant tanks like the A9 and A10, as well as lesser-known vehicles, were completely alien to me. As such, I'd like to showcase those forgotten tanks in my own designs. Speaking of which, let's cover some of those inspirations. Perhaps the most dominant is the historical cruiser tank Mark II, A10, as perhaps is obvious when comparing the two. Here we see the final product in all its glory. This tank certainly represents the pinnacle of my talents at this time. Just looking at the obvious, we can see the hull is not simply flat plates with some rivets. Instead, we find extrusions and angles, as well as this headlight cover that I'm quite chuffed with. Now, that's enough gawking over silly little details. Let's get into the main attributes. Looking at the front, we can see an asymmetrical front plate with a hull-mounted machine gun on the right side, and the driver's position on the left, in respect to the hull. Anti-slip extrusions were added to the sloped plate to assist the crew in boarding. Turning our attention to the fenders, and we can spot spare track links. Fun fact, the early cruiser tanks suffered frequently from thrown tracks. I'm sure this crew are glad to have some spares, just in case. On the inside, we have two crew in the frontal fighting compartment, and as you can see, the internal details have been added, albeit in limited detail. I really wish to do more, however, I simply didn't have the time. Venturing to the rear, and here appears the engine deck. This is one of the areas I most enjoyed modelling. Using the add-on structures, I made side air intakes and a raised access panel for the engine. Looking internally, we spot the racing heart of any good cruiser tank. This large power plant necessitated a significant volume of the internal space to be used up by just the engine alone. However, it was more than worth it, with the BA5 being able to reach speeds of 30 miles per hour, just under double that of the historical A10. Since we're discussing mobility, we'll move on to the running gear next. 3 suspension bogies with 2 road wheels apiece are mounted on either side of the hull. Whilst the HVSS style suspension isn't my preferred type, there aren't any others to use, so we'll have to do. Finally, onto the turret, and it is immediately noticeable that it is unlike the turrets of older Britannic tanks. In a lore context, the decision was made to standardise the shape and components in the lead up to wartime production. As I'm sure you've noticed, the turret is of the style that was common amongst the early cruiser tanks, with some slight adjustments, such as the Matilda cupola. In a Sprocket's perspective, on the other hand, it was mostly due to the flat-sided turrets being easier to model and replicable. In terms of firepower, we're looking at the ubiquitous 2-pounder anti-tank cannon. famous for its use throughout the early war. In this tank in particular, it offers a well-rounded and powerful cannon that would defeat any opponent you'll run into. There isn't much to talk about in terms of armour. Of course, to achieve such a high speed as the BA5 is capable of, sacrifices had to be made, and this primarily came in the form of thin armour, with only a uniform 25mm thick plate on the front and sides, with it becoming thinner on the back and top. Whilst we give this devilishly handsome tank some good cinematics, we'll bring this showcase to an end. At first, I did not like the BA5 at all. I believed it wasn't original enough and lacked a sense of difference. Whilst it does have an uncanny resemblance to the A10, the design has rather grown on me, and in the end, it has become my favourite tank thus far. That concludes today's video. Thank you all for watching, and have a good day.